Good morning and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate podcast. We are today on episode number 126. Good morning, David. It's nice to do one of these just with you and I. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's always fun. Back to our roots when it was just the two of us, and every once in a while we get to do on just the two of us on a topic, which is always fun. And we got an interesting one to talk about today. That's for sure.
Yeah, one that I think the whole industry, the whole country, President Biden made a comment on national TV about this a couple of days ago. And, all the news media outlets are picking it up and circulating it. Of course, they're taking his comments completely out of context, but, everybody seems to be talking about the NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors, and the groundbreaking settlement that they've reached. This was a most people don't recall or don't know, but this was a 15-year in the making settlement. This isn't something that is new. This was in the court systems. This went through arbitration. This went through, a lot of stages, a lot of due diligence, a lot of processes. And my sentiment, David, when I read a lot of the press conferences, I spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks reading these press conferences and watching some of these press videos. My sentiment is that, there's a lot of stakeholders that are happy to, put this to rest and are kind of happy to close the chapter on this and move on. What are you hearing out there?
Well, I think that's true. And anytime there's a settlement after a long battle, you think it's just time people say, let's just get this done one way or the other and move on. But maybe just to fill in a little background for people, this is in the U.S. It's got nothing to do with Canada, but it's we're thinking about it in Canada because this will have an impact in Canada and Ontario and our local practice as well. So, and this was, a lawsuit started in the U.S. in Missouri, and it was a bunch of plaintiffs complaining against the real estate industry and that commissions were too high, and they felt they had nowhere to go, and it really was focusing on the buyer representative side of the transaction, saying, we sort of get why a seller earns commission. They've got the listing, they're marketing the property, they're entertaining offers, but they're saying, like, why is the buyer's representative getting half a commission? And they're talking about, standard commission 6%, and there's a split, and they put it on multiple listing, and automatically 3% goes to the buyer's representative, 3% to subs, and that's sort of what was at the heart of this. That there was a feeling out there that there's a ripoff. Buyers, the property's up for sale and they're getting 3%. Now, way back when property values were lower and you sold a beautiful home for $500,000 and the commission was 3% of that, I think people didn't care as much. But all of a sudden, that $500,000 home in a lot of markets is worth $1.5 million, and 3% of $1.5 million is a lot of money, and it's the exact same work that the agent would have done if the price was 500,000. And I think that's sort of part of the problem too, David, to the fact that the commissions in your industry are all tied to the purchase price. And as inflation went up, I think that became a big factor, right? So there's this massive lawsuit, bunch of plaintiffs, name the National Association of Realtors as a defendant, and a whole bunch of brokerage also as a defendant. And they're going on and back and forth, basically trying to come up with a new model or a variation of the model, and then finally reach a settlement.
Yeah, and NAR was very adamant that they don't agree and they don't admit any guilt in reaching this settlement, which I think is really important. They said that they will appeal, or some of the stakeholders said that they're going to appeal the decision, but that comes at a cost. 15 years in the court systems is a lot of money, it's a lot of resources. And ultimately, I think the industry realizes that consumer choice is the North Star in the industry, right? And at the end of the day, in Canada, our co-op commission on the listing agreement is variable. When you look at a listing agreement, it's a blank line. And in conversation with the listing agent, The seller has choice. They can put $1, they can put a flat fee, they can put a percentage of the purchase price. And we've seen listings come on the MLS system, that are selling for $1, where there is no co-op commission. Or there's certain models that say, hey, the listing sold for $1, but contact the seller because maybe in certain situations the seller is willing to compensate the cooperating agent more. So we are seeing different models of commission evolve, but by and large, we have a great system. And David, you and I have talked about this a lot. Our real estate, our organized system of selling real estate is the gold standard in the world. In the world, I come from Poland in Europe, and the real estate is sold in a very different manner where both realtors retain compensate, or sorry, both parties compensate their respective realtors. So if you work with a buyer agent, the buyer compensates the buyer agents. And we see that that system, doesn't work as well, right? Um, and real estate is not sold the same way. And the whole mentality here is, do you save $1? Do you give up $100 to save $1? Right? Um, and we see it, and buyers and sellers understand that there's value to hiring a realtor. Otherwise, they wouldn't hire a realtor. And our system, there's you can list on the multiple listing service for a flat fee. You can get a discount realtor to represent you in these, big transactions of your life. But are you going to get the full benefit of the market? Are you going to get the best price? And we see this time and again that a great agent, a professional agent, brings so much value to the transaction that time and time again, sellers and buyers recognize that there's a lot of value there. Um,
Yeah, look, I'm not a real estate agent, but I play one in the movies. No, I always wanted to say that. Um, but I've been around the industry forever. As a real estate lawyer, I talk to agents, talk to brokers. I've got a son who's a real estate agent. So, I'm all around it all the time. And I can make, I think, a very coherent argument why a buyer's representative earns every penny of their commission in most instances, as much, at least as much as a seller's representative does. Okay. Because there's examples where sellers representatives, you don't think that they're doing much because you're in a market where, you put up a sign and it'll sell in 2 seconds with an offer, whether it was staged or wasn't staged. Right. So, and people say, oh, I should have sold privately. I would have, I could have sold it myself. It sold in 2 seconds. Well, it sold in 2 seconds because usually there's a lot of underlying work that the seller's agent did behind the scenes, right? So we can argue on behalf of seller's representative, but you can make just as good an argument on behalf of buyer's representative to know your client, to find out exactly what they're looking for. Okay. Where the parks are, where the schools are, where the transit is. Um, how many bedrooms with future development, to make an addition, to put a pool in the backyard. There's so many variables that go into someone's choice and decision to buy. And if you're a buyer's representative, you got to do your homework and do it properly. And you're providing great value. And then you're doing all the comparables and running around and looking at those neighborhoods. Like, they're working hard. Now, every once in a while, a seller's representative gets really lucky and they earn a commission and didn't have to do a ton. And every once in a while, buyer's representative have the same experience. They take them to one house, they put an offer in, they get it, and they got a windfall because they earn a $40,000 commission and they probably spent, $5,000 of their time. Okay. But how many are on the other side of that, where they're spending $40,000 worth of their time and, to run around to try and earn a commission they may or may not get? So in my view, over time, and over time, I mean, like, I've been doing this for a lot of years, like close to 40 years. And I think it evens out. And I don't think that overall, on balance, buyers representatives are overpaid. Now, I get the argument just because it's always been tied to a percentage that, the argument I made before, if it was 3% of 500,000 or 3% of $5 million, sometimes it's the same work. Right. And it seems like a lot of money that they're earning. But It sort of evens out. But anyways, that's where this is going. Okay, so I think we could probably agree, David. Buyers representative have a add value and have an important role. The question is, what's the best way to compensate?
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about this in lieu of this podcast coming up and us having this conversation. I've been trying to wrap my head around some of the points and some of the um settlement agreements that were reached, and I actually think this is a one-sided settlement because um what the plaintiffs did is they looked at the system and they argued for such a drastic change, but consumer choice relies on the fact that both scenarios need to be entertained in the system, right? Where the savvy sellers that understand the value of offering whatever co-op commission they want have that ability. But if they don't want to offer a co-op commission, they also have that ability, right? And what this lawsuit did is they looked at our system of MLS and they said, no, we're not going to be displaying any co-op commissions on the multiple listing services moving forward. So they actually took consumer choice out of the market. And nobody knows if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Um, certainly we're deorganizing our level of organized real estate and going into Europe territory where it's a fragmented system. It doesn't work really well. you know um, Sellers are disadvantaged by that system too because that system doesn't encourage cooperation. It doesn't encourage multiple people to look at the property. It kind of encourages hey, there's a buyer here, he's here to buy your property, end of day. And the seller never understands, well, is that really the best market price? Market price is determined by supply and demand, right? And on the demand side, if there's more demand than supply, then the price increases. Like it's a basic factor. And the system sort of keeps checks and balances and is in equilibrium. Now, if we discourage cooperation, meaning that there's a whole bunch of realtors out there that have hired a realtor, right? And they're compensating them. And now they have to pay a high price for the house and compensate the realtor in addition to that price. So now it's, money coming out of their pockets and not being added to the mortgage. I think that disadvantages sellers in terms of getting them a lower price for their house, discourages competition, and they're never going to know. Listen, did we really get the full market value for our home? And it's a concerning system to be in because the realtors that are savvy on the co-op side that get to the listing first are going to win, and the seller's going to be in a position where, hey, they got a great offer in their mind, but did they really get the best offer that the market's willing to give them?
Yeah, I think some of this discourages some professionalism in the industry. And I take that seriously. And let me explain what I mean. A lot of times, it's easy to focus on purchase price. Did they get the best price? Did they sell for the best price? Did they buy for the best price? It's all about price, price, price. But you and I know that's only part of what really goes on in a transaction. And one of the most important rules that whether you're a seller's rep or a buyer's rep has is to make sure that the buyer or the potential buyer is qualified to buy this property and can actually close the transaction. And this is what we've been dealing with for the last 6, 9 months locally. Like it's been a challenge to get transactions closed. We've got parties under contract, binding agreement to purchase and sale, and we got buyers that can't close because in some cases, they can't mostly relate to financing, but some cases there was multiple offers and they took the best price and they didn't necessarily take the best buyer. And the seller's rep didn't do enough to check out the buyer, and the buyer's rep didn't do enough to check out their own buyer and make sure they could qualify and close the transaction. That's a problem. Like that's a real problem. And that's an important role that the agents play in this. And I think this is sort of discouraging some of that. And it's like, and part of this is because we're in a world now where there's so much information available to anybody online, right? I can, if you're a buyer, what do I need an agent for? I can just look online. I get all kinds of information about the property. I can get comparables. I can get, there's all sorts of apps to access and information. So why do I need it? Well, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to become a real estate agent yourself, even for your own property, try and figure that out, right? So it's easy to argue there's benefit to having a professional do it. But the professional is also going to qualify you as a buyer and look into your affairs and make sure that you can afford what you're planning to buy and that you've got all your ducks in a row and you have proper mortgage approval and proper inspections and proper lawyer acting for you and all that stuff to make sure you can actually close your transaction. So I think we have to keep that in mind as part of this too.
Yeah, of course, the second point of a settlement is that now working with a buyer will require the realtor to enter into a written agreement, which, really no different than what we're doing with TRESA in Canada. The groundwork for that is really laid. The only difference is that TRESA does create implied representation versus in the States, I think they want, a rock solid written agreement before you engage with buyers. But again, I think this is good for the industry. I think this adds transparency. I think it solidifies the agent buyer relationship. And I actually really like that, David. Something that we encourage at the brokerage level. We've always been fans of, doing a proper buyer presentation when working with a buyer client. Hey, what are you going to do? What are the benefits? Explain the fact that there's a fiduciary relationship created, that it's a two-way relationship, that now the buyer, you're their agent. Now, every single time they walk into the open house, they can just give your business card and say, hey, I'm represented by, Sutton Group Summit Realty. I have a great brokerage behind me. So I like that. And I think that's good for the industry. I think it's good for everybody. It creates transparency and it really solidifies that professional relationship.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And just for anybody that isn't as familiar with what this settlement was, just there's sort of two parts to the settlement. One is there's a monetary settlement, and NAR, without admitting
Guilt,
wrongdoing,
right?
somehow agreed to pay $418 million to settle this. We didn't do anything wrong. Everything's good, but we're going to pay $418 million out to a bunch of parties to settle this. So that's the first part of it. Okay. And that's going to be paid over 4 years and it's still subject to court approval, et cetera. But that's part of it. But the other part that I think you're focusing on, David, part of the real negotiations and settlement, aside from the monetary, was it forced certain practice changes to be considered and implemented. And the main part of this is separating the automatic commission that would go to a buyer's rep and a seller's rep, that automatic split. So they call, they're decoupling that commission to separate it. So they're saying, okay, seller pays their agent, buyer's agents, they can negotiate with their buyer and make their own deal. So that's sort of like the main thing. Now, the fact there would be more transparency and it opens up the system and it allows for different models to be used. Like, I think that's all great. Okay. But let me ask you this, David. If you're a buyer and you're paying your own rep, you've agreed because you're negotiating to pay your own rep, whatever you agree to pay them, whether it's based on a percentage or a flat fee, and you're looking to buy a property that's listed for whatever it is, how is that going to affect your negotiation as a buyer when you go to the seller in terms of the price that you're prepared to pay?
Well, obviously the comparables and the listing price has a built-in 2.5% to the co-op agent. It's built in, it comes off on the statement of adjustments. So now as a realtor, when I go to negotiate the purchase price, we're gonna have to have a conversation with the buyer saying, hey, listen, you know, um, the co-op commission has to now be added back into your offer. So let's work the calculations. Let's work backwards, and let's submit a price on this property, knowing that you have to come up with the co-op commission. And the biggest point to this whole conversation is that the co-op commission has to now come out of the pocket of the buyer in reality. There's probably going to be certain mechanisms that are going to be built into place that is going to change that over time. But looking at the most simplest version of this, that's coming out of the buyer's pocket now. So and remember, leverage is one of the biggest um, enablers for the public to purchase real estate, right? You only have to come up with 20%. You don't have to come up with 100% of the purchase price. If you're a first-time home buyer, you can come up with as little as 5%. So now, if I'm a buyer and I only have 5% to purchase a property, and the commission has to come out of my pocket, I've actually lost half of my purchasing power, right? So that's going to affect the market. It's going to affect sellers in the short term. There's going to be solutions created to this where there's certain mechanisms that are going to be created to overcome some of these objections. But the simplest answer is that it's going to have to be factored into the buyer's offer and taken into account when submitting an offer on a property.
Yeah, it just makes sense. Like a buyer's not going to pay the same price that a seller wants if the seller was like the seller's looking at what their net is going to be after I pay commission, after somebody pays commission, but they care about what they're paying. So if they sell for $1 million and they got to pay $100,000 in commission to agent, and they're gonna end up at 900,000. That's what the seller is going to be focused on. Now, if the seller sells the property for 950 because they're only paying one commission and they end up at 900, they're in the same position. So they just have to be shown it's going to be the same to them. And the same thing for the buyer. But the buyer's not going to pay the $1 million plus pay their agent a commission, because they're never going to do that. So it's always going to be factored into the price, right? It's still going to be factored into the negotiation differently. I think the bigger issue will be whether the buyer representation agreement is going to be a percentage fixed on a purchase price, or our buyer's representative is going to start accepting more flat fees based on time spent or something, and they're going to start earning a lot less than 2.5% of a price. That's the sort of, but on the other side, there is a little bit of savings for buyer too, because if the prices get reduced because the buyer's commission's taken out of the price that they're ultimately offering a seller, then the buyer is going to pay less land transfer tax on closing by that amount too. So the government's going to lose revenue here on every transaction when this happens. I don't know if they've focused on that yet, because they might not like this. They might like the current system because they're going to lose that buyer's commission as part of the purchase price, and they get land transfer tax on every one of those.
Yeah, and that's substantial. There's a lot of real estate transactions that happen in Ontario. So, you look at that small percentage of every single transaction, and it adds up very quickly.
Mhm.
But David, status quo, uh, the good realtors are having those commission conversations right now with their sellers. They're not afraid of having those commission conversations. They're not afraid of putting those numbers on paper and saying, look, this is what you're going to net. This is what you're going to pay to the co-op agent. This is what you're going to pay me as the listing agent. And the reason they're not afraid to have those conversations because of the amount of value that they bring to the table. These are realtors that do professional marketing, that do professional photography, that do professional video services, that do drone services, that advertise in media like Facebook, Instagram, newspapers, right? And if you can bring that sort of value to the table, why wouldn't you be afraid of saying, "Hey, you're selling a $2 million house. You're paying me 2.5%. That's $100,000. $50,000 to me, $50,000 to the other agent. But look, if I subtract my assistant, my brokerage fees, my advertising fees, my professional video fees, my service fees, you can show that you actually net, a small percentage of that money. And by being a professional realtor and having these conversations and not being afraid, right? And being, coming from that abundance position, coming from that professional position, nothing changes in your business. The only thing that changes is the accounting. Now it's not coming from the seller, it's coming from the buyer. And now you're going to have to prove your value to the buyer, right? I, David, this problem is created by, the part-time agents and the agents that haven't been trained properly to have these conversations. And the agents that think that, hey, the market's really strong, I don't have to bring a lot of value. I can take pictures of my own cell phone, post them on MLS. I'll use the old description. I won't even give it any thought. My phone's gonna ring and I'm gonna make 2.5%. These are the agents that are causing, these plaintiffs to be upset about, these high commissions. And unfortunately, there is quite a bit of them. There is a lot of part-time agents. We talk about this a lot on the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. Over 50% of the agents haven't done a deal in the last 12 months. A huge portion did less than two transactions in the last 12 months. Like, that's substantial. And I wish we could just take all those realtors and get them out of this industry, because I think the conversation changes.
Well, when this decision came out, a lot of the headlines were, and the talking points were, this is going to drive half of the real estate agents out of business, right? Because there'll be no more buyer representation agents, and this is going to kill the business completely for half the agents in the industry, right? So obviously, that's those are headlines, those are talking points.
Right.
But I agree with you. I think it will have that effect to some degree, and I hope that you're correct and get what you want. And what I would like is that it drives all those part-time agents out of the industry, because they're not going to be able to satisfy buyers that they're adding value, right? They're not doing it full time. They don't know the market the same way. They don't have the resources. They just have their agent license. So when a friend or relative wants to buy a house, they can say, "Hey, let me know when you find something, and I'll put my name on it, and I'll earn a quick commission on it." Without doing that. So I think those are the agents, I hope, that with all of this are the ones that are going to be driven out of the business, because they just can't add any value to make it really worth their while to do it, right? So if that's the effect, and you're left with all the professional agents back in the industry, that's a great effect,
Yeah.
for everybody.
And my message, if you're a realtor that works really hard, that does all the right things, that brings a lot of value to a transaction, you have nothing to worry about. Sure,
Exactly.
sure.
That's the most important message.
Some of the processes might change a little bit here or there. There might be some adjustments, but I can guarantee you that it will be business as usual, that you're probably going to be even more in demand, and that your business is going to thrive, right?
Yeah.
If you're a part-time agent that brings very little to a transaction, that doesn't market, that is not professional, I would be very worried. And that's really the bottom line on this settlement, in my opinion.
No, I agree with you completely. And we want to talk a little bit about the local market and what's gone on in Ontario, and TRESA, the changes that they've brought to the table. So it's like TRESA and Ontario was sort of anticipating, because like you said, we talked about this at the beginning, like this settlement, it's not something that happened yesterday. This has been going on for years and years and years. So there's already, every province was looking at this in Canada, and every realty organization in Canada was looking and monitoring this and trying to figure out, what do we have to do to stay ahead of this? And Ontario is no exception. I think that's why TRESA has introduced some of these transparency obligations, the differences in in the agreements that you enter into. Like we've already got some of those effects in play here in anticipation of that, which is a good thing. And it was interesting, when the TRESA legislation came out, as you know, like, some of us in our firm were sort of on tour going around different brokerages talking about TRESA and how people have to comply with these new changes. And it was amazing the pushback we got by some real estate agents when we're doing these seminars and webinars on this. I remember doing one. It wasn't at your brokerage, but I was doing a live one, and we had about 150 people show up live, and I was with one of our young associates, and it was almost like a riot was going to break out. There was so much angst. And I was saying, first of all, don't shoot the messenger. We're just telling you. So it's, but they were attacking us for explaining what TRESA was imposing on them. And I said, listen, all they're trying to do is make you, all this legislation, it's making you more professional. Most of you, the good ones in this room, are doing it already.
Doing it already. Yep.
Doing it already. And that's why you're successful. It's for everybody else. It's the part-timers that don't want to do this and don't want to complain. They're the ones that were almost in a riot stage complaining about this, because I think they felt right away this is a lot of effort, because they're not organized that way, they're not professional that way, they're trying to do some other business and do this on the side, and this is going to drive them right out. So if it has that effect, that's a win for everybody, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Look, I love this industry, and I want realtors to bring more value to transactions. I want realtors to be professional. And I want a mechanism that weeds out the realtors that are not conforming to those really high standards. And the standards should be high, David. Like realtors, we have a big responsibility in our hands. This is the biggest transaction that anybody is going to do in their lifetime, by and large. Where I'm not talking about the big commercial business owners and stuff like that. By the average person, this is going to be their biggest transactions, and they deserve to have a professional realtor represent them in that biggest transaction, and protect their fiduciary duties at every step of the way in a professional, diligent, and responsible manner. And that's what TRESA really hopes to accomplish. Now, one thing I'm going to say is, I wish what the industry did more of is really focus on education. Because I think that's where, we can get out of a lot of these sticky situations. And I'm going to take and tie this back to a practice that we've been doing at Sutton Summit, you know, since I can remember. This has been in place, and David, you can probably speak more about this because you've been involved with Sutton Summit, a lot longer than I have, right? Within your relationship. But Brian Maguire and Jack Ellis had a 3-minute callback guarantee, right? And what
Three
did that
minutes.
do? It was called the 3-minute callback guarantee, right? If a realtor had an issue or a problem, they were always available very early in that issue to come in and help. And that de-escalated things, right? So again, it starts from education. It starts from, being available. It starts from having the right support system. And if we can focus on some of these issues that TRESA, that the NAR settlement is trying to solve through education, and have a much higher bar set for entry into the industry, for staying in this industry, and really focus on education, I think 95% of the issues that these plaintiffs have, that public perception has about their industry, can be addressed. But realtors need to be forced to educate themselves more, to be professional, to approach the business the right way, and to protect those fiduciary duties of the consumer. And it needs to be industry wide. I'm a huge proponent of education, and I think education would really solve a lot of the issues that we're seeing.
I agree with you. And you look at what TRESA is designed to do, and even RICO, that administers it. It's all based on consumer legislation. It's all for consumer protection. It's not really for realtor protection. but you end up having realtor protection out of it. But it's all designed to protect consumers, because the consumers that do the complaining, my agent did nothing, my agent made a mistake, my agent did that. Like, it's in dealing with the agents that aren't professional, it forces changes to the industry. And I'm hopeful that because everybody's now taking a hard look at the model that we're using and requiring more professionalism by the realtors, which ultimately protects the consumers, that it's going to have the effect of just, if you're an agent, you're either going to get on board and be professional and do all the education that you need that's available to you and do it right, or find another business to be in, because you can't do this part-time. You're just causing problems in the industry. You're not going to earn any money because you're not going to be able to satisfy anybody that you're adding value to anything. And and who you want to would anybody want to go to a part-time doctor if you have a serious problem?
Can you
Do you
imagine?
want to go to a part-time lawyer? Do you want to go to a litigation lawyer to close your real estate transaction? Do you want to come to me to deal with your immigration problem? I'll make a mess of it. Oh yeah, let me figure it out. I'm a lawyer. I can figure out immigration law, and put your life in my hands, and I'll figure out whether or not I can get you into this country or not. Like, why would anybody make those kind of choices? You want a professional to act for you. So, like, this is all a good thing. I agree with you 100%, David. I wouldn't be, if I'm a pro in the industry right now, I'm a realtor doing a good job right now. I have nothing to worry about. Nothing to
Nothing.
worry about. This is only going to help me because it's going to drive out some of the weak competition that I have. And if I'm left with a bunch of good competitors, that's good. It's always good to have somebody professional on the other side of a transaction. That helps you get your transaction closed and move on to the next one.
Yeah, that's the biggest takeaway from the NAR settlement is that if you're doing all the right things, if you're representing your clients, if you're marketing, if you bring a lot of value to the table, and if you're not afraid to have commission conversations, you're gonna excel in this post NAR settlement environment, the post TRESA environment. But if you're an agent that doesn't think you're worth that 2.5%. You're afraid to have those conversations. You're afraid to write that number on a piece of paper and put it in front of your client because you don't think you're worth it. You have a big problem.
Agreed. If you should always be worth it. Then it's up to you if you want to give a discount for some reason to a friend or a relative. But you doing your job properly, you'll earn your 2.5% every time.
Yeah, and look, I encourage the realtors listening to this podcast. If you're listening to this podcast and you're saying, you know what, um, I don't know if I can prove my worth, right? And realtors struggle with this. This is a big problem in the industry, David. Like we see this, in all corners of the industry. We see this with really, professional, high volume agents too. They struggle, and the reason I know they struggle is because they struggle on the listing commission, right? So um, you are going to have to get a lot better at proving your worth. So if you're listening to this podcast, reach out to me. Reach out to me. I want to talk to you guys. And I'm going to tie this back into my experience really quickly. When I first got my real estate license, I was working for a discount brokerage where they advertise that on the listing side, they will charge only 1%. That's the brokerage that I started at. And I very quickly found out after my first year of being in the business that, I made a quarter of what I made listing properties, and I made substantially more money working with buyers because the commission was by and large 2.5%. But I had a problem with that because I loved listings. I loved working with sellers. So I left that brokerage and I went to a different brokerage and I re-engineered my business. And I said to myself, you know what? I am only going to charge 2.5% on the listing side. And I went back to a lot of my clients from my early days in my real estate. And when they called me a second time and I went in for that listing presentation, I had to get very good at proving my worth to them and saying why they should now pay me 2.5 times more than what they paid me the first time they worked with me. But it made a substantial difference to my business. And the biggest thing, it was like flipping a switch. I had to believe that I'm worth 2.5% and that I'm worth that commission first. Because if I don't believe in it, there's no way you can make anybody else believe that you're worth it. It has to start with you. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're struggling with proving your worth, you're struggling with charging at 2.5% on the listing side, please reach out to me because I am very passionate about this. I'll walk you through step-by-step process of what you can do, a listing presentation, how you can prove your worth. And I'm very, very passionate about that. So if you're listening and you're struggling with that, reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation with you.
Well, I hope people take you up, take your offer up and get in touch with you. Because you know what? A lot of them just wouldn't sit down and spend, like make a list of all the things that you do or that a buyer's agent should be doing. And first of all, are you doing everything on that list? Because you should be. But when you sit down, you can make a list pretty fast of all the things and all the steps you should be doing to do a proper job for your client. And you'll see pretty quickly that all this going to take a lot of time and effort. And you're going to be earning your commission by doing it. And if you're looking for the shortcuts and the quick wins, every once in a while you'll have one, but you're not going to last in the industry very long. So professionalism is great. And if that's what comes out of this, because it's focusing everybody to look at how their industry is working, and it'll offer more transparency to the consumer and offer consumers more choices and different models. It's all good. All good. It'll all settle down, and I think it'll just and the industry will benefit as a whole. Okay, so 50% of you don't have to worry. I don't think that you're going to be out of business. Don't read those headlines. And if you do believe the headlines, then do what you have to do to make sure you're not part of that 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Great conversation as always, David. And check us out on social media. Send us an email, send us your questions. Love to connect with you. And again, if you're struggling with commission, it all starts with you. Reach out to me. I'd love to have a one-on-one with you and take you through how I overcame some of those objections. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.